That's not final. While the question of why Square Enix continues producing Final Fantasy sequels if they are final usually comes off satirically, it does not come as a surprise that they would want such a successful franchise to continue. But what is it that makes it so successful? In this video, I aim to, through critical theory, game mechanics, and character identification, assert my interpretations to the significance and effectiveness of these electronic arts in relation to their genre, the variety of their potential audiences, and what that variety itself means. The first place that shows evidence of connection between the parts of this massive video game franchise are the recurring character names. The most vivid example of this self-reference occurs in the 9th installment, where there is a theater scene in which Marcus, played by Zidane, says, "No cloud, no squall shall hinder us," which identifies the two protagonists of the two previous installments, Squall and Cloud. In the context of the scene, Marcus refers to his escape with Cornelia, but in the context of the history of the franchise, suggested by Zidane's remediation, it signifies a sort of industrial victory. Just quickly looking at their history, Square began developing role-playing games for the NES in the mid-1980s, but by 1987, the popularity was declining along with their business. So they began developing a game inspired by Enix's Dragon Quest series. They titled this project Final Fantasy, recognizing that it may be their last production. However, it was far from it, considering it solved their financial problems and began their most popular franchise. By referencing one another in the scene, video games prove their existence as part of a history, rather than an isolated, anonymous work. Square's identity and history becomes meaningful with the phrase, "No cloud, no squall shall hinder us," during Final Fantasy IX by asserting the quality and dependability of their product. It is as if to remind their audience of the success of the two previous installments and their continued expansion of a well-established series for over a decade. Whether or not this is an effective method for advertising, this kind of history and meaning is what engages the audience and elevates Square's product to more than just a game. Square has marketed action figures, posters, and other physical merchandise, but when I refer to their product as more than a game, I refer to the use of metatheatrical elements. Though this idea of Metatheater originated in the dramatic arts, it also applies to any art form which comments on itself, drawing attention to the performative situation of audience and actors, or to the literal act of its production. Naturally, the previous scene lends itself to a metatheatrical interpretation because it takes place in a theater, and it references Shakespeare several times. For instance, Lord Avon is the author of the game's dramatic performance, I Want to Be Your Canary, and Stratford-upon-Avon is Shakespeare's birthplace. Several characters in the play also resemble characters in Shakespeare's plays such as King Leo and King Lear. This play exists at the beginning and ending of the game's plot, framing the whole narrative, as does the position of the curtains on a stage. Shakespeare popularized the analogy of the world as a stage, and it appears to reference his works, evoking that same imagery. These dramatic elements attempt to engage the player not only with the game, but also in the world that it represents. These devices are all throughout the series, from the constant melding of player controls with the actual physics of the world to the opera scene in Final Fantasy VI, but I'll focus on a few of the more poignant instances. The Sorceress's inaugural parade in Final Fantasy VIII is very theatrical. The player experiences a uniquely designed background which includes interactive non-player characters, but also includes a background scenery, which consists of other members of the crowd. Though Squall and Irvin try to be discreet, crouching while they get to their objective, to us, the audience of the game, they are the foreground while the crowd is the background. The float which the sorceress rides on serves as the stage for the characters to observe, but to the player, the stage is the audience, the actors, just another member of the audience. The soundtrack for the sequence of the plot, an ominous march tune, is also named The Stage is Set, suggesting the intention of these metatheatrical elements. Also in Final Fantasy VII, the Junon inaugural parade for President Rufus puts Cloud in a similarly theatrical situation. While trying to infiltrate Shinra ranks, Cloud puts on a uniform and is mistaken as one of the performers in their parade. As a former Shinra employee, he remembers certain code gestures. Cloud is dressed up like an actor would and convincingly performs the appearance that he is part of the group, a group which is then performing for another audience. How well the player performs in the parade is dependent on how well they blend in with the other soldiers, and this is indicated by a TV ratings percentile in the user interface and dialogue from commentators. If Cloud sticks out, the ratings go down and the commentators focus on a certain performer who is underperforming. This is also viewed through the medium or our screens, adding another layer of metatheatrical complexity to this scene. It represents the game's identity as part of something that not only larger than it appears, but also as something that continues to grow larger. As the series continues to grow, it continues to comment on the past and foreshadow the future, creating the potential for limitless complexity. The main theme here results from the metaphor that art is a mirror through which we see reality. If Cloud can convince himself and others that he is someone who he is not, then the difference between imagination and reality becomes cloudy. This blurred distinction becomes the most apparent in the Luca plot sequence in Final Fantasy X. First of all, Luca is one of the largest cities in Spirit because of the stadium, a theatrical place that serves as a blitzball stadium and an amphitheater. A loyal fan to the series, however, would recognize two familiar songs in the background of the opening Luca cinematic.
Ladies and gentlemen, the day we've all been waiting for. The opening tournament of the season. This event.
The first one is the Rufus welcoming ceremony from the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, which sounds like this. And the second one is Queen Braun Appears from the Final Fantasy IX soundtrack, and that one sounds like this. Okay, now let's listen to the original again.
Ladies and gentlemen, the day we've all been waiting for. The opening tournament of the season.
Indeed, these are the two themes from two of the previously mentioned situations where performance and art are self-aware. The relationship here is then presented during Maester Micah's opening speech to the Luca Blitzball tournament, which is viewed from a television inside a Luca cafe.
Today, on this glorious day, players from all over Spira have assembled here to participate in this great contest of bravery, skill, and strength. All of these fine teams, equally renowned, deserve to win the cup today. Such is the nature of this contest. Let us, the spectators, play our role accordingly.
The line, "Let us the spectators play our role accordingly," is especially meaningful considering the genre of this series of video games, the role-playing game. It suggests that these spectators are not only the citizens of Spira, but also the spectators who play this game. The main audience of this genre is implied to be younger, but the fact that these stories focus on the growth of the main character or characters suggests a universal identification. The binary of childhood and adulthood is an essential issue to approach in defining roles. This subjectivity begins, according to Jacques Derrida, with the criticism of binary oppositions, like male and female or off and on. Our purpose for creating these oppositions, he says, is to overturn them. Meaning is created by something's difference or relation to other things. For example, black and white are clear binary oppositions, but the point at which we stop defining something as black and start defining it as white is less clear. This is because we use words like white and black, signifiers, to identify something that we perceive, the signified. When someone shows us a structure with 4 walls and a roof and tells us it is a house, we can generally agree with them. However, when we are also told the same structure is a barn, we begin to consider other factors such as location and purpose. We can also suppose a barn if we are only told the location and purpose of that structure, and suppose a location and purpose given a barn. This difference between signifier and signified is what Derrida believed created identity, and identity is one of the most important elements of role-playing. Final Fantasy is very aware of the androgyny of their characters. It is difficult to immediately identify what gender Kuja is, if any. This is only a label, and in Final Fantasy VIII, Squall appears to be aware of this during the sorceress assassination sequence when he responds to Irvin. Right and wrong are not what separate us and our enemies. It's our different standpoints, our perspectives that separate us. Both sides blame one another. There's no good or bad side, just 2 sides holding different views. The binary opposition of right and wrong is overturned here, and as a result, we learn more clearly what role Squall plays as a hired mercenary in this political war. Richard Bartle, in designing virtual worlds, notes that the alignment system is an effective way of defining characters. Originating from the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing board game, the alignment system characterizes players based on the notions of lawful and chaotic, and good and evil. On the axis of good and evil, good generally implies the preservation of life, while evil the destruction of it. On the axis of lawful and chaotic, lawful generally implies adherence to rules and concern for others, while chaotic, the reluctance to adhering to rules and concern for oneself. Neutral is the middle ground, which is usually characterized by acting on instinct. Another potential aspect of neutral characters is the conscious decision to be so. Rather than acting solely on instinct, true neutral characters may act neutrally on the belief that balance is necessary between the axes. While Squall does not necessarily act on the part of balance, his quote about perspectives certainly displays an awareness of his role. This self-awareness in role-playing has been a theme so far, and will continue to denote especially meaningful moments and scenes. Another difficult to categorize and therefore meaningful character is Seymour from Final Fantasy X. His motivation to destroy the world seems evil at first, but the intention is to prevent suffering, which appears also to be good. He's a Maester of Yevon, a highly organized religious institution which suggests lawfulness, but he also ends up being a major cause for the dissolution of Yevon and his race, the Guado. He even kills his father, the person who brings about his existence, suggesting a chaotic disposition. While he seems to contradict himself, his actions maintain the balance of life and death, salvation and destruction, and in his quest for balance, his self-awareness and moments of clarity provide the characters and the player with insight on their respective realities. In discussing Seymour's marital request to Yuna, the following conflict is revealed.
You know what Yuna must do.
Of course. Lady Yuna, no, all summoners are charged with bringing peace to Spira. But this means more than just defeating sin. She must ease the suffering of all Spira. She must be a leader for the people. I proposed to Lady Yuna as a Maester of Yevon.
Spira is no playhouse. A moment's diversion may amuse an audience, but it changes nothing.
Even so, the actors must play their parts.
The whole scene is very theatrical, with a mysterious microphone swinging from a cord attached to the ceiling and the audience metaphor. Though Oren appears to hold the majority opinion at first, Seymour's response goes unchallenged. The player is able to gain different perspectives on the situation through the many other characters, whether it is security, time, politics, or selflessness. Every character provides a different dispute to the purpose of marriage for love. Eventually, the marriage becomes favorable to the characters. This opening of perspectives occurs not only for the characters, but for the player as well. This game, and any art form, is just a moment's diversion. Yet it teaches us essential truths that are neglected every day. The villain is not always wrong. There are a lot more colors than black and white. You do not need to love someone you marry, and more importantly, you do not need to marry someone you love. Maturation is also evident in Final Fantasy X, when Tidus becomes aware that he will no longer exist if he saves Spira from sin. Despite the selfishness he shows when he first arrives at Besaid by disregarding the teachings and entering the Cloister of Trials, he eventually sacrifices himself to save Spira and Yuna even though he hates Yevon's philosophies of sacrifice. The clearest symbol of this binary occurs after the party defeats the guardian worm Evrae. The cutscene shows Evrae's Pyreflies, a recurring symbol of assured death within the game, falling over Seymour's marriage, the social institution of ensuring the creation and preservation of life. It becomes clear that both life and death require each other. No one can die if no one is alive, the main premise behind Seymour's quest to destroy the world. Also, sometimes some must die so that others can live, the main premise behind the Summoner's Pilgrimage. Once again, the interaction of these binaries facilitates growth and an essential understanding of both the world of Spira and the player's world. Growth implies change from one state to another, but the plot of any story focuses more on the conflicts and transitions between those states, or the process. Arnold van Gennep, in his Rites of Passage, notes that the life of an individual in any society is a series of passages from different liminal periods. Liminality is the state of transition or ambiguity that occurs in rituals or phases like birth, puberty, marriage, and death. Characters that are liminal are either experiencing these transitional phases or hold positions that exist between conventional societal expectations. Unsurprisingly, the characters of Final Fantasy are brimming with ambiguities. Just in Final Fantasy VII, Cloud and Vincent are former Shinra employees, now fighting against Shinra. Red 13 and Aerith are the last of their kind, between extinction and existence. Reeve, or Katesith, is a double agent spying on Shinra for Cloud's party and spying on Cloud's party for Shinra. Now in Final Fantasy X, Yuna and Seymour, half-human and half-Elbed Guado, respectively are the links between their races and humanity. Braska, through one of Jet's spheres, comments on the liminality of his party composition.
They're wrong. A fallen summoner, a man from Xanarkand, and a warrior monk doomed to obscurity for refusing the hand of the priest's daughter. What delightful irony it would be if we defeated sin.
Stop gabbing and get me out of here.
Of course, change is not always that easy. Final Fantasy X's sequel deals with the conflict of two factions, the Youth League, who want change, and New Yevon, who resist change. Despite the world being saved, the essential paradox of change will always exist. Things will remain the same, insofar as they will continue to change. Resolutions are only temporary. Even on a more personal level, the difficulty in change is depicted in the graduation sequence of Final Fantasy VIII. We learn that 3 of our playable characters, and 1 non-playable, have passed the exam. Cid walks up to each character and whispers in their ear a personal encouragement. When he gets to the non-playable character Nida, he says, "Do your best, even if you don't stand out," which resembles an aside in drama, which is when an actor says something that the audience is supposed to hear, but not the other characters. If we take this address literally, Nida is then a representative of the audience. It is difficult to find an identity in a multitude of others trying to find theirs. We can also assume that Cid's encouraging words to Squall, finally a gunblade specialist, would have been said to Cypher had he graduated, because he and Squall were the only persons who fought with a gunblade. This suggests a sort of uniqueness and comments on the binary between unique and indistinguishable. Cid's emphasis on learning rather than following orders provides the base for the entire seed and garden metaphor, that the most intrinsic purpose of education is to grow and mature. Cid says, "You must follow orders exactly during combat, but I'm not entirely without sympathy for you. I don't want you all to become machines. I want you all to be able to think and act for yourselves." End quote. But as all living beings are intended to grow and mature, it is difficult to do so without feeling like a machine. This is the conflict for Squall, a normally introspective person who becomes leader of a small squad of Seed, and then eventually of all of Balam Garden. He struggles to lead because of his callous disregard for his squad members, but eventually becomes a source of inspiration, delivering a moving speech during the fight with Galbadia Garden. This awareness for others marks his growth throughout the story and is the essential conflict of growing up, finding an identity while simultaneously taking on responsibilities. Liminality continues in Final Fantasy X with the phenomenon of the unsent. Having died in a brutal manner or having a strong will to finish something in the mortal realm, these spirits are neither living nor dead. Unsent maesters of Yevon are capable of holding their positions, providing knowledge while maintaining political power. Orin is able to ride Sin because he is unsent, allowing him to travel to and from Dream Xanarkand. These characters are uninhibited by the limits of mortality, but also uninhibited by the limits of lifelessness. Similarly exists Dreams. Dream Xanarkand and all of its inhabitants are imagined into existence by the faith. We are not certain that Tidus once existed in the real Xanarkand, but perhaps someone like him once existed. This ambiguity of dreams, along with their position in between reality and imagination, makes them liminal characters. The connection between Unsent and dreams is that both are composed of pyreflies. Machen, a traveling scholar and Unsent, provides the player with knowledge about, among many other things, what pyreflies may be. He says, "The Albed have a theory, you know. They say the pyreflies are just reacting to visitors' thoughts and dreams, but only the dead appear on the far plane. No image of the living has ever been seen. It's a great mystery, but maybe the dead leave a bit of themselves in the hearts of the living, and that little bit borrows the pyreflies' power for their paranormal performance. Or maybe not, who knows. They may be called pyreflies, but they aren't really flies, you see. They're those lights you see whenever a fiend dies. The little fellows are responsible for a few fantastic phenomena. Visions of the past, spheres, fiends, these are all the pyreflies doing. In fact, pyreflies have something to do with aeons, too. The dreams of the faith reach through the spirit of the summoner, and that which is unreal becomes real for all to see. Or maybe not, who knows. Out of all the theories and implications that can come from this, I want to note the recurring theme of metatheater and liminal characters. The phrases paranormal performance and that which is unreal becomes real for all to see once again compares the player's world to the game. In Luca, there is a theater separate from the stadium. In it, players can buy music spheres or movie spheres, which are cinematics that have already been experienced throughout the game as sort of a recollection of memories. Once the player has purchased all of the music spheres, the vendor will tell them that all of the spheres have been purchased. However, when all of the movie spheres have been purchased, the vendor says no more are available at the moment. This suggests that the last cutscene has yet to be unlocked for purchase. But because the player cannot use a save sphere after completing the game, they are unable to return to the Luca Theater and turn that memory into a sphere. The effect of expressing this inability to progress beyond the ending emphasizes the value of life. If the final boss is defeated, Titus and Orin, a dream without a dreamer and an unsent having fulfilled his purpose, will vanish. As a result, players will go back to before the ending to travel Spira, complete side quests, find better gear, and learn spells to better prepare them for that inevitable ending, familiarizing them with an issue that most mature adults still struggle with: accepting that which is final. We are now able to assert the reality, or at least the connection to reality, that these video game sequences expose their audience to. But the other half of understanding Final Fantasy is the fantasy of it. Even characters within these games take time to experience their own fantasy. Final Fantasy IX's opening sequence, a massively popular annual play, serves as a cover-up for the kidnapping of the princess. The princess, who only wishes for freedom from the expectations of royalty, runs from Steiner, who wants to protect her, Zidane, who wants to flirt with her, and the rest of Tantalus, who want to kidnap her. They all end up on stage accidentally during the play, blurring the lines between what is part of the play and what is improvised, what is real and what is fantasy. Bertolt Brecht noted a tendency for this type of self-awareness in theater in his essay, Alienation Effects in Chinese Acting. He identifies the alienation effect as a creation of the actor who exposes their art. He says, the artist's job is to appear strange and even surprising to the audience. He achieves this by looking strangely at himself and his work. Everyday things are thereby raised above the level of obvious and automatic. End quote. The purpose of creating this vulnerability in their art is to invite criticism for the issues raised and for the art itself. Brecht found that this resulted mainly from the deviation from immersion, While being emotionally attached or empathetic to a character often creates strong feelings, the alienation effect can be just as strong. Brecht details one scene where a Chinese actor screams silently. Though we are shown an emotion through indirect gestures, the audience can still imagine what it would feel like to suppress one's own involuntary action. The performer then becomes an observer of itself, and the observer in the audience relates, as they are also an observer. Immersion is a large component of the fantasy genre, but there are still some aspects of this series that, whether intentional or not, break that immersion. The beginning of Final Fantasy VIII certainly immerses the player in its setting of Balamb Garden. The opening cinematic depicts one of the first arguably realistic sword fights in a video game, making it a symbol of technological progress in the industry. Soon after, the player progresses to the Seed Field Exam, which is introduced by Headmaster Cid. He says, "You will be proceeding to a real battlefield. Obviously, the battles are for real. Life and death, victory and defeat, honor and disgrace. Each of these go hand in hand." Once again, binaries are introduced here, suggesting character development. But the repetition of defining a real battle as real gives an irony to the next few hours of the game. They are, of course, fake to the player and only an exam for the characters. The game then continues to pull back and forth between immersing and alerting the player. The landing at Dalit cinematic begins with a formation of fighter planes soaring over the background of a full moon. Then ripples on the water form from the fleet of ships, revealing that the planes were seen through a reflection. The then astonishing graphics, along with the unique and intense soundtrack, appropriately named The Landing, create a massive scene that draws the player into the conflict. However, briefly during the cinematic, Squall holds up a transparent sheet over a printed picture of the distant town of Dalit. The markings on the sheet resemble strategical instructions and objectives that were devised beforehand. The game filters our screen with yet another layer or two of mediation and calls attention to the process of analyzing or planning this series of actions. The ships and planes all needed communication to be synchronized and had prescribed orders for the mission. All of this staging perhaps originated in a room, at a screen surrounded by invested participants, not too different from the situation of the development of this project, the game itself, and the anticipating onlookers who consume the finished product. Similarly, in the opening of Final Fantasy VII, the cinematic breaks previous video game barriers by seamlessly transitioning from a full-motion video of space to a flower girl, to a full view of the city of Midgar, then shifting to the actual gameplay graphics at the scene of the rebel terrorist organization Avalanche, beginning their attack on the oppressive Shinra Company. The soundtrack transitions with the repurposing of the sound of the train letting off steam as the tempo of the next piece. These elements once again facilitate the audience's connection to the scene, but they also later become the reason for their disconnect. Due to a desire to maximize their potential output, Square was unable to develop all gameplay to the same quality as the full motion video cinematics. As a result, the characters that the players become accustomed to during the majority of the game will completely change models during these heightened moments in the story. While the player can still recognize who is who, they become acutely aware during these cinematics that they are no longer in control, and the differences in these character models undergo more scrutiny from the attentive audience. The inverse of this issue is created when the player chooses to take the staircase at Shinra headquarters. Barrett complains about the length of the stairs, and the player is not exactly sure when the stairs will end because they're appears no difference between each level. Other than a few items on the floor and some dialogue between the party members, each scene looks identical to the last. Similarly, in a play, the stage would not change to illustrate this. It would just be implied or described by the action of closing and reopening the curtains, or a fade to and from black for the video game. As many of these identical scenes progress, Barrett gets irritated and impatient, to which the following dialogue occurs. Tifa says, "Barrett, pull it together." He replies, "Well, all I know is I'm just flesh and blood. Don't treat me like I'm some ex-member of Soldier or something." Tifa replies, "What about me? I'm human too." The fact that Cloud, an ex-soldier, witnesses this argument questions his humanity. As we learn, Soldier is a class of genetically enhanced troops with superhuman strength. Not once during the stairwell ascent does Cloud, unlike Tifa and Barrett, seem tired or agitated. The player as well is not tired, but excited by the prospect of the end of the stairs, and as Cloud observes this conflict, so does the player share in this omniscience. Later on in the Shinra building, Professor Hojo attempts to mate Eris with Red 13, comparing the two completely different species. Both the ancients and the feline species he calls animals, to which Tifa exclaims that Eris is a human being. However, when Red 13 is asked, he says, "Hojo has named me Red 13, a name with no meaning whatsoever to me. Call me whatever you wish." Barrett then asks, "What are you?" Red 13 replies, "An informed question, but difficult to answer. I am what you see." Due to philosophical inquiry and programmed interactivity, we are presented with perhaps the greatest fantasy. The suggestion that we may not be human, just as Barrett is human insofar as he is only connected to a mechanical arm, and Cloud is human insofar as he is genetically enhanced. We are humans immersed in a technological and fantastical world. But our lives, unfortunately, will never be as interesting as these fictions. As earlier explained with the Final Fantasy VIII character Nita, most of us will not change the world. During the train hijacking sequence in Timber, we are shown the thoughts of one of President Deling's guards. He thinks about how he should do his job or role despite its questionable morality, so he can be paid. Something we all must consider in supporting ourselves. We learn that this guard is trying to get married, but can't afford it if President Deling keeps cutting his wages. This provides another binary to the growing Seed members. He is not a distinguishable character, illustrated by his reused character model for many of the other soldiers. However, by attributing this extra layer of story to a seemingly indistinguishable character, Square places an unusual emphasis. They create a complex conflict, essentially, which is, at its simplest form, the interaction of two conflicts. For example, Headmaster Cid married Sorceress Adea, and Cid is the leader of the Seed, who must fight Sorceress Adea. The interaction of these two conflicts creates the bigger conflict of whether he should carry out the assassination of his own wife or fail his mission to save his wife. Cid still fulfills his role as headmaster of the garden by carrying out the order, but there is hesitation because of his other role as husband. By creating this kind of conflict for the seemingly inconsequential Galbadian soldier, it is suggested that anyone can be the protagonist of their own story, even though it is not a major role in the overall story. In order to sustain ourselves, we are forced to fulfill many unsatisfactory roles. This is vividly stated in Final Fantasy VII after the Mako reactor bombing, when a guard tells Cloud, "I got the miserable job of keeping scum like you from trying to sneak in here." Also, despite the controversy surrounding the Shinra company's use of Mako reactors, there are still many people willing to be employed there. Cloud had earlier discussed this issue with Barrett. He says, "No one lives in the slums because they want to which Barrett replies, "It's like this train. It can't run anywhere except where its rails take it." It is these moments of diversion that brighten our dimly routine lives. Fantasy has the same purpose as described by Samuel Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria as to give the charm of novelty to things of every day and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us, an inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude, we have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Final Fantasy continually raises these essential and timeless issues. Unsurprisingly, why there are so many nostalgic fans. It reminds us of a time when we were innocent, like two boys in Final Fantasy X who say they want to be an Albed and a Blitzball when they grow up. But also when Grav, a rival Blitzball player, says, "Even kids can play, boys," we are reminded that no one is too old to play games, to appreciate art. And by promoting an awareness of binary oppositions, there is an awareness for others, whether through sympathy, maturity, or collectivity, that simultaneously identifies and immerses ourselves in the fantastical elements of our world, one that does not end when we have been defeated or when the credits roll.